guys, welcome to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel, and this is also my first ever YouTube video, so I hope that you'll bear with me through any teething issues that I might have, and hopefully this will get better in time. My name is Holly, I live in Brisbane, Australia, and have been obsessed with true crime for as long as I can remember. So I created this channel to share with you some of the most famous, infamous, and lesser known Australian true crime cases throughout history. So for episode 1, I chose a case that I was really interested in when I first heard about it, but I struggled to find the level of information that I wanted when I watched other videos and other coverage of the case and read media stories about it. Today, I'll be sharing with you the case of the mother-daughter murders. Karlie Pearce-Stevenson and her baby daughter, Khandalyce Pearce, were brutally murdered by someone that Kylie knew and trusted. And one of the major reasons that I was so interested in this case is because the two girls were found in completely different states, 5 years apart. Now, this case involves not only the murder of a child, but it also involves child sexual abuse. So if that is not your thing, I totally understand. Maybe meet me on the next one or skip through those parts. So there were a lot of places where I could start. This case spans over a decade, and usually I would start at the beginning and finish when I get to the end. But for this case, we're going to start on Sunday, the 29th of August, 2010. Brothers Emmett and Dave Hudson decided that they would go on a trail ride with some of their friends. Now, these were two proficient riders, and usually they would have head straight into the Blue Mountains, which was west of them, but their friends urged them to meet them about an hour and a quarter south in the Belanglo State Forest. Now, you might recognize the name Belanglo. It was actually the hunting and dumping grounds for infamous Australian serial killer Ivan Milat, and I will definitely be doing an episode on Milat in the future. But the state forest also contained some really great fire trails. So the two brothers were the only two of this group that had never ridden the Belanglo trails before, and really early on Emmett took a wrong turn. He started looking for somewhere that he could turn around. He knew the rest of the group wasn't far behind, so he looked further up ahead and saw a small clearing that he could use to spin around and get back on the trail. Now, he noticed something in the dirt in that clearing that immediately caught his attention. It was a bone. Now, he assumed that it was an animal that had died there and called out to his brother to come and take a look, and Dave arrived with one of the other group, Jeff. The three of them had a bit more of a look around and came upon some more remains, and Jeff, who happened to be a chiropractor, recognized the bones as a hip bone and a femur by the way they had fit together. The three boys decided that it most likely came from a kangaroo that had died in the forest, and so they head back to the meeting spot so they could grab some lunch and then head back on the trails for the afternoon. Now, Emmett and Dave still felt like something was off with what they had found, and after lunch they decided to go back into the clearing and have another look at the remains. Dave had actually recently finished reading Sins of the Brother, which is the book which details how Ivan Milat had dumped his bodies, and Dave remembered that Milat would usually leave his bodies under fallen logs or in trees to stop them from being found. Dave noticed a fallen log in the clearing, and when he lifted it, he saw what could only be a human skull. Now, he also saw a small tuft of hair and some rib bones, and the immediate thought was that this was a previously unfound and unidentified victim of Ivan Milat. Dave called the local Bowral police station to report the finding. Now, the Bowral police station was small and it was rural, and it had a reputation for hikers and campers reporting finding bones in the forest, obviously assuming and afraid that they too had stumbled across another Milat victim. The officers knew that these calls almost always resulted in animal remains, so they were wary of attending the clearing and leaving the small station short-staffed. They asked the group to send through a picture of what they had found to the sergeant, but when he received it, he immediately recognized human remains. 3 officers arrived and the group led them to where they had found the skeleton, and the officers quickly cordoned off the area. It was now officially a crime scene. The only detective on duty at the station at the time was Detective Senior Constable Bill Doughton. Now, as he headed out to the crime scene, his mind travelled back 18 years to the crimes and the investigation of the Malat murders. Coincidentally, Bill Doughton was actually the first detective called out to the Belanglo State Forest when the first Malat victim had been found. So it was really hard for him not to think about Malat. The similarities in what the boys had found to Malat's bodies were very clear. They'd been found under a log just like Malat's victims had been, but Doughton actually recognised that most of Malat's victims had been in the northern area of the forest, and this discovery had been in the southwest. He also asked himself where would be the best place to dump a body where someone else would be blamed, and this did seem like an ideal spot. Doughton arrived at the scene and immediately noticed the bones. He saw a leg, he saw the skull, he saw some vertebrae. He knew due to the exposure of the clearing that it was no surprise that the remains were scattered, and they did look like they'd been there for months or even years. Now, a lot of evidence would have been destroyed by bushfires and scavengers and flood, and the exposure made it almost impossible to tell if this person had died in the forest or if they had died somewhere else and been taken to the forest. At 9 p.m. that night, the police released a statement about the discovery of the bones, and every single radio station, newspaper, news television program, every media outlet obviously speculated that this could be another Malat victim. After 24 hours of cataloguing evidence, the officers and forensic investigators still had no idea how long the body had been there. The police search of the area lasted a total of 3 days, and a number of pieces of evidence were recovered, including a small sock and a silver earring, but among that was a t-shirt. Now, this shirt had been left for so long that it had dried hard into a ball, but once they had smoothed it out, they noticed that it had the word angelic printed on the front of it. The bones were then sent to the morgue, and forensics determined that the remains belonged to a female aged between 13 and 25, and that her body could have been on the forest floor anywhere between 6 months and 10 years. Now, this information immediately abated the media, as Malat had been sentenced in 1994 and had been in prison ever since. So even if the body had been there for 10 years, Malat would have already been locked up for 6. So it definitely wasn't him. There was no way it could have been. The pathologist had discovered the cause of death, though, noticing fractures along multiple ribs on both sides of the chest, and the force required to crack the ribs was enough for pathologists to confirm that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the trunk, possibly and probably by forceful kneeling or stomping. In the western suburbs of New South Wales, the Forensic and Analytical Science Service Centre compound is home to New South Wales' only forensic DNA facility. And 2 days after the remains were discovered in the forest, the tibia bone was sent to the facility with a request to generate a DNA profile. Now, this job was left to Karlie Wilson, who was the only biologist at the centre qualified to extract DNA from bones. Now, this was at a time where DNA evidence was only really truly being realised, and the National Criminal Investigation DNA database had just been created to help match criminal DNA to DNA found at crime scenes. Now, Karlie Wilson was surprised and pleased to find that the degradation of the bone was minimal despite the exposure of the clearing, and she was actually able to extract a full DNA profile. The profile was immediately uploaded to the database, but there was no match. The database couldn't provide a single clue about who this girl was. The New South Wales Missing Persons Unit began selecting cases to compare with the profile, and at the same time, the New South Wales Homicide Squad was brought in to take the lead on the case. The case was assigned to Detective Sergeant Tim Atwood. In the weeks after the body was found, Atwood and his team shortlisted dozens of missing persons cases from 3 different states. The Belanglo State Forest is on a major highway that connects Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT. And if there was no DNA profile of the missing person, detectives would request for a living family member to be found so that they could compare familial DNA. Now, this process was not automatic. Karlie Wilson was required to manually try to match the familial DNA to the profile that had been extracted. She kept coming up with no matches though, and the shorter the shortlist got, the more that investigators and detectives became concerned and worried that they had missed something at the scene. They needed to know who this woman was and why no one was looking for her. For over 2 weeks, detectives, forensic experts, and biologists devoted their time to DNA testing, but they hadn't come up with any solid leads, and the only thing they had of identification was the size 10 t-shirt that was found with the body. Now, to avoid cross-contaminating the DNA evidence on the actual shirt, detectives decided to have an artist create an impression of it to release to the press. New South Wales Homicide held the press conference on the 15th of September 2010, and showed the press and the media the sketch of the shirt. And this was the first time that anyone outside the investigation would see any of the clothing evidence that had been collected at the scene. The media immediately gravitated towards the inscription "Angelic" on the shirt, and the body became known as Angel. The investigation dragged on with no new leads and no new information, and no results had come of releasing the image of the t-shirt. Now, in an interesting and gruesome turn of events, months after Angel's body had been found, the state forest was once again in the media, but this time for the murder of 17-year-old David Auchterlonie, who had been murdered by his friend Matthew Milat, nephew of the serial killer Ivan Milat. Matthew Milat famously said to his friends on the night of the murder, "You know me, you know my family, you know the name Milat. I do what they do." Of course, the media attention this attracted was huge, and Matthew Milat became a suspect for Angel's murder. But detectives felt like the timeline didn't work. Matthew would have been younger than 16 when this murder had occurred and could have been as young as 7. So he was ruled out as a suspect, and the detectives were now at a complete loss as to where to turn. On the 2nd of December 2011, over a year after Angel had been found in the forest, a reconstruction of what she may have looked like was released to the media. There were a total of 35 calls to police based on this image being released, and even though every single one of them were investigated, nothing led to the breakthrough that police had been hoping for. With no missing persons matches, no family coming forward, no DNA evidence, the police still had nothing. Atwood and his team took on other homicide cases, but they did keep working on the Belanglo case, just desperately hoping that something would eventually come up. But months started turning into years, and it seemed like Angel's identity would remain unknown. Now, 5 years after Angel's body had been found, in July of 2015, 3 men were driving on their way to Adelaide when they pulled over to relieve themselves in the small rural town of Wanaka. The driver walked a few metres off the side of the highway and noticed a tattered grey suitcase lying on the side of the road. Now, he looked a little bit closer and he noticed the contents were all over the place. There was a pink jacket, a black ballerina tutu, some Holdem branded silk shorts, and in striking similarity to the 2010 Belanglo case, there was one item that he really paid attention to. It was what looked like the jawbone of a small child. Now, the next day when the group arrived in Adelaide, they contacted the police and reported that they had found a child's body on the side of the highway, packed into an old suitcase. Within hours, police were swarming the location, and inside the old 60 by 40 suitcase was a small human skeleton. The body was wrapped in a towel, and forensic pathologists confirmed that this was stained with blood. Now, this told investigators that the body was not in its skeletal state when it was placed inside the suitcase and thrown off the side of the highway like garbage. The skeleton had no skin or tissue, but there was some long blonde hair, and wrapped around the skull was duct tape from the chin to the cheeks. Under the duct tape, forensics found 2 dishcloths inside the jaw pushed down towards the throat. The area was in complete lockdown, and investigators needed to start the task of examining the bones and creating the crime scene. The police also needed to canvass the entire township of Wanaka, which luckily was a town that boasted a population of 76 permanent residents. They went door to door to see if any of the residents had noticed anything unusual, no matter how small, in the preceding months and weeks before this discovery. The residents were shocked at the discovery, and they were more than happy to provide whatever assistance necessary to help police in this investigation. A couple of the residents actually reported seeing a strange man carrying a suitcase a few weeks before, but this did not eventuate into any reliable leads and couldn't actually be confirmed. The bones were examined by forensics and they showed no other evidence of injury, and due to the duct tape and cloths found in the mouth, pathologists reasoned with a pretty high level of certainty that the cause of death for this poor little child was asphyxiation. Forensics had also uncovered the child was female, ranging in age from 1 to 4 years old when she had died, which could have been as far back as 2007. Either no one knew this little girl had been missing, or no one cared enough to report her missing. Over a month after the child had been found, she had still not been identified. Her DNA profile had been extracted and uploaded to the database, but there was no match, which is hardly surprising considering there is no way a 3-year-old child's DNA should be on a database for criminals. Now, forensic officers spent weeks going through the clothing and the items that were found in the suitcase, and they were mostly mass-produced items of clothing from stores like Target and Kmart and Big W, but there was one item that looked unique and handmade. It was a quilt made from patches of animals and flowers and had been bordered by colourful musical notes. At a press conference in July, 12 days after the bones had been found, police dressed a mannequin in the clothing that was found at the scene to try to jog someone's memory about maybe seeing a small girl in those particular clothes. They also released an image of the quilt. It was over 2 months later, on the 6th of October, that a woman named Tanya Weber called to report that she thought the girl might be Khandalyce Pearce, daughter of a friend of hers, Karlie Jade Pearce-Stevenson. Tanya said that it might be a real long shot. She hadn't heard from the girls in years, but she recognised some of the clothing, especially the quilt with the music notes on it. 2 days later, on the 8th, Tanya called again to insist that the detectives follow up on the information she'd provided, and also letting them know that she had photographs she could send them. Detective Sergeant Blake Horder was the investigator in major crimes that was tasked with calling Tanya back and requesting that she send through the photographs. 3 photos were sent to Horder that day, and all 3 were of 2-year-old Khandalyce Pearce. About an hour later, Horder was back on the phone with Tanya asking a series of questions about the 2 girls. What was their family name? Where was their last known address, their last known mobile number? Where was the child born? And all of the details of Karlie's grandmother, who Tanya had said had made the quilt that she had seen in the press conference. Tanya provided Horder with all of the information that he'd requested, as well as the contact details of Karlie's stepfather in Alice Springs. And on the 11th of October, Horder made contact with Scott Povey, Karlie's stepfather, and Scott emailed him a picture of Khandalyce in a stroller with the handmade quilt that his mother had stitched for her in 2007. Khandalyce had her immunisation records from when she was about 18 months old, but police could find no enrolments into any schools or kindergartens, and they couldn't find any other medical records. It seemed like that in 2008 this little girl had simply vanished. Investigators were able to obtain a sample of Khandalyce's newborn screening test and compare it to the DNA they had extracted from the bones found in the suitcase. It was a match. 3 months after the body had been found, detectives were finally able to give this little girl a name. They called Scott Povey to tell him the heartbreaking news that this was his granddaughter, but they asked him to please not say anything to avoid tipping off anyone who might have been involved. Scott and his family actually had to cut themselves off from their loved ones to keep the secret for almost 2 weeks, but they asked themselves only one question. If the body in the suitcase was 2-year-old Khandalyce, where was her mother, Kylie? Cara Wilson, for 5 years, whilst working on hundreds of other forensic cases, had still been trying to find a DNA match for Angel. 33 missing persons cases had been referred to her in the 5 years to try and match to the bones found in the forest, but each time there was no match. On the 15th of October 2015, she learnt she was being sent the profile from the little girl found in the suitcase in South Australia. South Australian detectives had been trawling through missing persons and unidentified remains cases to try and find a match to Kylie after finding Khandalyce, as no one had heard from this little girl's mother in years, and there were a few investigators that looked into the Angel case, noting that the age and the time frame fit Kylie's last known movements. Kylie had moved around a little bit, but back in 2008 she had ended up in Canberra, less than 2 hours' drive from the forest that Angel had been found in. Many officers were really skeptical. I mean, these were two bodies found in separate states over 1,100 kilometres or 680 miles away from each other, 5 years apart. It seemed like a huge stretch, but the chance to identify Angel finally was far too tempting for them not to at least try. Wilson got the email and printed off the two DNA profiles. Now, it's reported it took her 5 times as long as usual to compare the profiles because she really wanted to be sure, and she even had her superior double check, and he confirmed that these were indeed a familial match. The profiles were almost certain to be mother and daughter. Straight away, Wilson called Detective Atwood to let him know that she finally had a match. Atwood immediately had her sent a reference sample from medical records of DNA that had been drawn from Karlie Pearce-Stevenson years earlier. They needed to be sure that this was the person they'd been searching for 5 long years. Wilson ran the confirmation test, and once again, after 5 years of no result, she finally knew who Angel was. She was Kylie. Karlie Jade Pearce-Stevenson was born on August 7, 1988 in Alice Springs. Her mother Colleen and her father Bruce had separated before Kylie was born, and when Kylie was 2 years old in 1990, Colleen met the love of her life, Scott Povey. Originally from the Adelaide Hills, Scott had stopped over in Alice Springs on the way to Darwin, but he had been offered work in Alice and he had decided to stay on. Colleen and Scott had their first child together, Luke, in 1992, and 3 years later, in 1995, they were married in the Alice Springs courthouse. Now, Scott and Kylie had an up-and-down relationship. It was mostly loving, but as many teenagers do, Kylie began to rebel against her parents, and Scott tried to discipline her unsuccessfully. As Kylie got older, she started pushing the boundaries even further. She was frequently skipping school and she was stealing money and cigarettes from her mum's purse. The relationship between Scott the disciplinarian and Kylie the rebellious teenage girl was getting more and more strained, and at 15, Kylie decided to move in with her grandmother Connie. Now, the Stevenson family were really close and they all lived in the same area, preferring to be close to one another. All of the cousins would play together regularly while Kylie was growing up, and moving to Connie's house meant that Kylie was still really close to all of her family. Connie was the matriarch of the Stevenson family, and she often opened her home up to any other members when they were in need. Kylie was very close with her grandmother, but she was also close to her mother Colleen's best friend, Tanya Weber. Throughout her teenage years, Kylie worked at her Aunt Ray's snack bar and showed real responsibility and maturity. But after a casual hookup with an unknown man, at 17, Kylie found out that she was pregnant. Now, she had always had maternal instincts and she was really looking forward to being a mother, but she was so scared that Colleen and Scott wouldn't approve. Now, as it turned out, Colleen and Scott were thrilled to know that they were going to be grandparents. And in June of 2006, Khandalyce Kiara Pearce was born. Khandalyce, or Candles as her family knew her, was a beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed cherub of a baby and was absolutely adored by all of Kylie's family. Later that year, in 2006, Kylie met Robbie Frampton when he was working as a security guard at the Belanglo bar. Soon after they were dating, and not too long after that, he had moved into Kylie's small room at Connie's house. The pair soon got pretty tired of sharing a tiny space, and Scott had said that the president of the local Speedway committee, who was one of his good friends, would offer the pair the on-site apartment at the Speedway in return for fixing it up and $100 a week in rent. The pair jumped at the opportunity, and Robbie was elated. He had Kylie and he had Khandalyce and he had his new life. He also knew, though, that Kylie wanted more. She eventually had hopes of moving out of Alice Springs and travelling Australia and then the world. Now, about a year after Kylie and Robbie began dating, Robbie was at work at Prime Cut Meat Supplies where he did deliveries when a man that he recognised walked in and introduced himself as Daniel Marshall. Daniel wanted to know if Robbie knew anyone who might be interested in buying some marijuana. Daniel had been making a living transporting drugs from Adelaide to Alice Springs. Daniel and Robbie quickly became friends and started spending a lot of time together with their respective families. Daniel had recently spent a lot of time travelling around Australia in his caravan with his partner Hazel, her two children Ryan and Willow, and Hazel and Daniel's daughter Lauren, who was a very similar age to Khandalyce. Every few weeks, Daniel left to travel to Adelaide to collect his haul of drugs and bring it back to Alice Springs. And while Hazel only recreationally smoked pot, Daniel was into a range of different substances, including ecstasy and ice. Now, Kylie had never really been exposed to that sort of lifestyle before, but after spending a fair amount of time with Daniel, by mid-2008, Kylie began heavily using ice. And even her family was concerned about how much weight she was losing and her erratic behaviour. And Robbie began suspecting that there was a bit more going on between Kylie and Daniel. On the 15th of September 2008, Daniel and Hazel set out to Adelaide for a weekend with their kids Ryan, Willow and Lauren. They had hired a 4-wheel drive and they packed the kids into the back of the car for the long 15-hour drive. Now, Daniel had recently been using hard drugs, and although he thought the effects were wearing off, he was still feeling them when he got behind the wheel. Shortly after they crossed the border into South Australia, they encountered some kangaroos across the highway, and Daniel, fearing that he would hit one of them, swerved sharply to avoid them. The vehicle ended up veering off the road and flipping multiple times before finally landing on its roof. As Daniel looked around the car, he saw Hazel still stuck into her seat by her seatbelt, and he saw Lauren still in her booster seat, but he couldn't see Willow or Ryan anywhere. Daniel had escaped the crash with a broken collarbone and thumb, but Hazel had extensive injuries. She had suffered major abdominal injuries. Both of her knees had been dislocated, with her left knee having a compound fracture and severe skin loss down to the bone. Due to infection, she eventually had to have her left leg amputated above the knee and would need to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. But Ryan and Willow unfortunately didn't make it. They had died almost instantly from impact, being thrown from the vehicle in the incident. For the next few weeks, Daniel travelled between Alice Springs and Adelaide, visiting Hazel in hospital while she was in a coma and in intensive care. Robbie at this point began noticing Kylie pulling further and further away from him, becoming distant, and in late October, after a large fight, Kylie told Robbie that she wanted to break up. She spent a little bit of time at a friend's house before eventually moving back in with her grandmother, Connie. Now, only a couple of weeks later, in early November 2008, Kylie showed up at Colleen and Scott's house and introduced Colleen to Daniel. Colleen immediately distrusted Daniel and really hoped that the two of them were just friends and nothing more. Now, Tanya actually arrived at the house while the group was still there, and she felt the exact same way that Colleen did on first impressions. And both of them were really surprised when Kylie announced that she and Candles were going to accompany Daniel on a trip to Adelaide the next day. Now, Colleen begged Kylie to let Candles stay with her while the pair went to Adelaide, following her mother's intuition about the man her daughter had just introduced her to. But Kylie flat out refused. She wasn't going anywhere without Khandalyce, and she wasn't about to leave her daughter behind. Kylie, Khandalyce and Daniel left for Adelaide the next day, and on their way they stopped in the town of Port Augusta, where Kylie's father Bruce was based. Now, Bruce Pearce was working at the time in Western Australia, so he wasn't home when Kylie, Candles and Daniel arrived, but his mother Lorna was. Now, she was so excited to meet her great-granddaughter for the first time. Bruce and Karlie hadn't spent much time together growing up, but they had stayed in contact mostly via phone call, and Bruce was absolutely devastated that he wasn't there to meet Khandalyce. The girls had originally been visiting with Lorna on their own, and there was a special relationship starting to be built between the three different generations of women. But then Daniel turned up, and Lorna noticed that the mood and the vibe of the visit changed instantly. She recalled that Daniel made almost no eye contact with her and didn't engage with her at all during the time that they were there. Lorna basically felt the exact same way that Colleen and Tanya had felt about Daniel when she met him. She didn't like him at all. She was unsettled by his behaviour, his attitude, and his demeanour. Now, before the girls and Daniel left, Karlie's aunt Alison, who was also there, took a picture of Khandalyce fresh from a bath with her mother, and it was the last photo that her family would ever take of either of them. About a week after Karlie and Candace had left Alice Springs, Tanya received a call from Karlie. Karlie was crying and was telling Tanya that she'd screwed up big time, and she was hysterical. Tanya was worried and tried to get more information out of her, what had happened, but Karlie wasn't giving much away. Tanya managed to talk her down a little bit and told her to come home. Karlie was so worried that Scott would be angry at her for leaving that she couldn't come back. Tanya tried to reassure her that that was not the case, and by the end of the conversation, Karlie's emotions seemed to have settled, and she again reassured Tanya that everything was okay and that she was fine. Tanya tried to call Karlie back a few times that day, and none of her calls were answered. So we need to take a little bit of time to talk about Daniel. Daniel Marshall was actually Daniel Holdem. He would use many aliases in his life, but was born Daniel Holdem on the 7th of October, 1974. His parents were Clara and Glenn Holdem. Clara and Glenn's families had grown up together, and it was only natural for the two of them to gravitate towards each other. They started dating when Clara was 15, and only 2 years later they were married. This marriage was not a happy one. Clara found Glenn to be demanding and lazy and a drunk to top it off. But they had one child together in 1970, and Clara thought that having another baby might just save their marriage. When Clara fell pregnant, Glenn was not happy, so much so that he pushed her to terminate the pregnancy. But Clara was just not having it, and 4 years after she had her first child, she gave birth to Daniel James Holdem. Now, Daniel's entrance into this world was not the smoothest. Clara struggled with the birth, and they eventually had to use forceps to get him out, and he was unresponsive at first. He was covered in bruises, and he was screaming, and Clara felt like a dark cloud would follow this child wherever he went, and that there was something bad or off about him. This caused Clara to not give Daniel the affection and love that a mother should have for a child. She cared for him, as in gave him shelter and food, and that was about the extent of the relationship that they had, which would be very telling about how Daniel would grow up. Shortly after Daniel's first birthday, Clara and Glenn's marriage had dissolved. It had ended for good, and as a single mother, Clara now had to find work to support her 2 children. She ended up taking work on a dairy farm and formed a relationship very quickly with her boss. She actually eventually married him, but only months after she'd started there, Clara ended up moving with her new partner and their collective children to Orange in New South Wales. They moved into a small Housing Commission home, and Daniel had a really rough time fitting in with the family. Clara's new partner was physically abusive towards Daniel and saw him as less of a stepchild and more as an opponent for the affections of his wife. As Daniel grew older, his behaviour started to become unmanageable. He was regularly in trouble at school, boys didn't want to be friends with him, and girls felt uncomfortable around him. He was often caught stealing food and personal belongings from other kids' bags, and he was also caught regularly stealing money from the lunch orders. Now, when he was 8 years old, the Department of Community Services, or DOCS, placed him in temporary care. But at age 9, his mother wanted to have him back, so he was placed back into her care in May of 1984. Clara and her husband actually eventually went back to DOCS later that same year to report that they needed to place Daniel back into care, They just couldn't handle his behaviour, and they were completely incapable of caring for such an unruly child. Now, many think this was more spurred on by Clara's partner than by her, and because of this, Daniel felt a lot of resentment towards his mother. It seemed to him like she had chosen this new man over her own son. In court documents from 1984, a caseworker labelled Daniel as attention-seeking, accident-prone, uncoordinated, and would require an exceptional situation to resolve his problems to have any chance of leading a fulfilling life. He was even caught ripping the fur off a cat, and we all know that animal abuse is a major red flag when it comes to displaying future psychopathic behaviour. Daniel's caseworker struggled to find him a new foster home, and so Daniel was sent back to live with his biological father Glenn in Moreland, just outside the town of Taree. He became really close with his father. He finally felt like he had a loving and caring parent that he could look up to. Glenn and his new partner had been trying to have a child themselves, but were not having much luck, so they quickly jumped at the opportunity to have Daniel stay with them and to protect him from the abusive life he was living with his mother. Now, this lasted for a little while, and it really seemed like Daniel was going to be able to turn his life around. But in 1985, Glenn got work driving trucks, and he spent a lot of time on the road, so Daniel was sent to live with his grandparents. And with his male role model gone, Daniel began rebelling again, and after a few months, and with no other family members to care for him, he was moved into a care home run by the United Protestant Association. Now, surprisingly, over the next few years, Daniel began excelling in school. He was part of boys' clubs, he participated in school sports, and he was regularly receiving praise from both his teachers and his principal. Now, it's unknown whether he started misbehaving again and was expelled, or if he chose to leave, but at 15, Daniel stopped going to high school and started working at a milk factory. Now, the biggest consequence of Daniel receiving an income is that he fell into drugs and alcohol and began to abuse both regularly. The drug abuse got worse when his father Glenn died tragically in a car accident. But despite all of this, Daniel still managed to develop a healthy relationship with a young woman named Kylie. Daniel and Kylie started dating as teenagers, and their relationship went really well for a long time. The pair eventually married and ended up having 2 children, a son and a daughter. Now, Kylie was a really good influence on Daniel. She encouraged him to try new things and eventually convinced him to play football. And for a time, this was a great distraction from his substance abuse. But an accident that injured his shoulder and his hand forced him to give the sport up. Now, Daniel, of course, blamed this on the universal bad luck that he had experienced ever since childhood, and all of these things that were happening to him, including the drugs and alcohol, they weren't his fault. It was a combination of his environment and his upbringing and the treatment that he had suffered as a child. Now, after his accident, Daniel and Kylie decided that they wanted to give themselves and their kids a new life, so they ended up moving to Coffs Harbour in New South Wales in 2001. He found a part-time job at Coastal Drilling, and he loved it. His boss was thrilled with his performance and his dedication to the job. But Daniel couldn't keep this facade up for long, and after years of drug abuse, he also started moving into petty crime, like forging bad checks. Kylie realized that she couldn't be with him anymore, and she also couldn't keep exposing their children to his behavior. She kicked him out and even filed for an apprehended domestic violence order, which was promptly ignored by Daniel. He just couldn't accept that it was over. In a very telling incident in August of 2001, Daniel showed up at Kylie's house and followed her to the children's school when she went to pick them up. He was begging her for another chance, and when she kept refusing, he just started screaming violent, horrible verbal abuse at her in front of all of the other children and parents. He then followed her home so closely that she thought that he was going to cause an accident with his children in the car. He ended up getting home before her and blocked her from being able to get into the driveway to continue to beg her for another chance. Now, quick-thinking Kylie decided that her best option was to pull right back out of the driveway and drive to the local police station. And this apparently scared Daniel, and he finally got the hint and gave up. He was charged with breaching the AVO, but began to miss his court dates and all of his appearances. He was either too intoxicated, he didn't remember them, or he just didn't care. He tried for a couple of years to convince Kylie to let him see the kids, saying that he'd changed and he was in counselling and he'd reduced the alcohol intake and he'd even gotten himself a new girlfriend that he was planning to marry. But he eventually lost contact with Kylie and the children for good. Now in 2003, Daniel had a new partner, and once again he chose drugs and alcohol over any chance of a normal life, and once again his partner took out an AVO on him, which he once again ignored, and he breached it by physically assaulting her. In 2004, Daniel left New South Wales and moved north to Queensland. He was trying to escape his legal violations, including fraud and breached AVOs and theft and missed court dates. He ended up in a share house in Tin Can Bay, calling himself Daniel Bishop. Now, it was around this time that Daniel met Hazel Passmore. Hazel and Daniel clicked right away. Hazel understood Daniel in a way that nobody else had tried to ever before. He bared his soul to her, told her all about his childhood and his life, and she wanted to stand by him. Sure, she wasn't happy about his criminal enterprises, but she agreed with Daniel that it was caused in large part by the way he was raised and the way he was taught to behave. Now, despite having a good relationship with Hazel, Daniel left town to go back to New South Wales, where he was almost immediately arrested for fraudulent checks, the breached AVOs, for theft, and for many other things. He was sentenced to jail time, and he spent 8 months locked up. Now, as he was being released, he found out that Hazel had given birth to a daughter, Lauren. Hazel claimed that the child was from her ex-partner, the same father of Ryan and Willow, but Daniel claimed Lauren as his own right away. He immediately asked Hazel to pack up her life and the kids and move with him to Taree, over 800 kilometres away. He wanted to go somewhere he knew to settle down for a while before deciding what was going to come next in his life. Daniel and Hazel moved into a small rented house and developed a good relationship with the house's owner. The owner of the house also owned the nearby caravan park, and he ended up making the pair a deal that if they helped him sell his caravan, including meeting with potential buyers and handling all the haggling, they could keep any profit they made over $2,000. Hazel and Daniel quickly sold the caravan for the reduced price of $1,500. They had found out from the buyer that he needed to buy the caravan and then go back home to sort out the registration, and he couldn't afford to be pulled over on the hour-and-a-half journey home. So Hazel took the cash, she wrote out a receipt, and she gave the guy some contact details so that he could come back and pick up the caravan. Now, Daniel quickly realised that he now had both the cash and the caravan, so he did what he does best. He resold the caravan to another unsuspecting buyer in the same situation, this time for $1,200. Now, over the next few days, both of these buyers desperately tried to contact the pair, but they were getting no answer on the details that they'd been provided. They both turned up looking for Daniel or the vehicle, and when they got there, they found the caravan gone and Daniel and Hazel's house empty. Daniel and Hazel had left with their stolen stacks of money and had decided to travel the country to show their kids the real Australia. They travelled through the ACT, through Victoria and through the Northern Territory, and in 2007 they arrived in South Australia. Some car trouble had stopped them from being able to go any further, and for almost 4 months they saved money from odd jobs and from welfare until they could get back on the road. Their next stop was Alice Springs. Daniel thought it would be a great place to raise the kids. No one would know his past and no one would know him, and it would be a great place for them to get a fresh start. He got work in a local used car lot and the mechanic's workshop and had moved his family from this local caravan park to a small townhouse once he had earned enough money. Now, later in that same year, Daniel walked into Prime Cuts Meat Supplies and spoke to Robbie Frampton for the first time. Now, in October of 2008, Hazel had woken up in intensive care to learn that her 2 oldest children had been killed in the car accident. Now, she was understandably distraught, but at the same time, she was informed that she would need to spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair and that her left leg had had to be amputated. Daniel arrived back in Adelaide again in November to be with her. But when she heard that he had brought Kylie and Khandalyce with him, she was furious, even after Daniel insisted that the girls were only there to visit Hazel. The girls ended up going with Hazel and Daniel on Hazel's first outing from the hospital. Hazel was wearing a long skirt to hide her amputated leg and was so self-conscious about having to be dependent on the wheelchair. She was suspicious of Daniel and Karlie and was angry and hurt that Daniel had brought another woman to Adelaide when he was supposed to be looking after her. She kept a close eye on the two during the day, and when she finally had a moment alone with Daniel, she let loose. She point-blank demanded that Kylie was not to go anywhere near Willow and Ryan's funeral, which was going to be held in a few days' time on the 14th of November. Daniel attended the service without Kylie, but the day after the service, Hazel received a message from him. He was saying that the police had caught on to where he was and that he had to skip town. He was saying things like he didn't have a choice and that they were going to catch him if he stayed. Hazel felt completely abandoned, and when she went past the motel that Kylie and Khandalyce were supposed to be staying in, she noticed that Kylie's maroon station wagon was gone. She knew that they were with Daniel. She was devastated. She was not only dealing with the death of her two children and the loss of her leg, but now her partner had left her for another woman. Daniel messaged Hazel numerous times claiming that he was just visiting family and Kylie had family in the area and there was nothing else going on between them. But Hazel didn't believe him. She began sending Kylie abusive text messages and Kylie replied telling Hazel that there wasn't anything more there. But Hazel was still unconvinced. She felt betrayed and she felt hurt, but most of all, she felt alone. Now, Hazel, in a move of vengeance, had decided to contact her lawyers to press charges against Daniel for the car accident. She was unable to work due to the injuries. She needed to be transported to and from specialist appointments. She would need her home modified, and she would need constant medication. When she was discharged in December, she sent messages to Daniel hinting at an upcoming lawsuit. Now, this seemed to change Daniel's mindset completely. He did a complete 180 and he told Hazel that he'd made a huge mistake and he wanted to come back to be with her and their daughter Lauren. He told her he'd be back in time for Christmas. Now, Hazel thought it might have been her threat of legal action that had brought about this change of heart and not because Daniel really wanted to be with her. But on the 19th of December, Daniel told Hazel he was coming home. Now, she'd moved into a transitional unit earlier that same day and had decided that she was going to go to the grocery store and buy them the supplies to make a romantic dinner. So it didn't really seem like she minded too much that he was coming back just because of the lawsuit. She was receiving calls from Daniel every couple of hours, but after expecting him home for dinner that night, he didn't return until 2 a.m. on the 20th of December, hours later than he should have arrived. And he was driving a different car, a white Holdem Statesman that Hazel had never seen before. He begged Hazel for another chance, and while she still held resentment towards him, he was familiar, he was comfortable, and he'd come back to her even despite her disabilities. She was just happy to have someone that would stick by her, even if it was superficial. Now, earlier that month, on the 13th of December, Kylie had called her mother, and while Colleen had hoped this meant that the girls would be back for Christmas, the holiday came and went without any word from them. Kylie had always been on the top of Colleen's mind, but she also had another major worry. Colleen had been diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer and had started chemotherapy. She'd had to stop working and she needed Tanya to help her while Scott was working away. He was doing that to provide more income for the ever-increasing medical bills. A few days before New Year's that year, Robbie got a message from Kylie saying that she and Khandalyce were living in their car in Adelaide, and it wasn't much longer after that that he got another message from her saying she was stuck in the small town of Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory and flat broke. Robbie said he would send her some money, and when she sent through her bank details, he noticed that in the short time she'd been away, she had changed her bank account. Now, they expected this money to help Kylie and Khandalyce get home, but weeks passed and they never showed up. Her family tried to contact her on numerous occasions, but all of their calls had gone unanswered, and she would only really contact them by text message. In 2009, her Aunt Ray got messages from Karlie suggesting that she had been in Queensland, and in January of that year, she contacted Colleen and said that she was in Mount Isa and wanted to come home, but she didn't have the money. So Colleen, without telling Scott, deposited $500 into Karlie's bank account, but again, Karlie and Khandalyce never came home. In June, Robbie got another message from Karlie saying that Kendall's birthday was coming up and she didn't have any money to buy her anything, so would he lend her some more money? On the 7th of August that year, Scott Povey received a message from his stepdaughter asking if he still cared about her. It was her 21st birthday after all, and it seemed like she was fishing for another loan. Scott replied telling her that they wanted them to come home, that they were more than welcome to come back, and gently reminding her that she was the one who had left them and not the other way around. Scott never received a reply. Colleen had also received numerous messages from Karlie over that year asking for money, but by the end of August of that year, the contact had all but ceased. The family were really worried at this point that perhaps something with Daniel had gone south, and the family decided that they needed to take action. They went down to the Alice Springs police station to file a missing persons report. Over 38,000 people are reported missing in Australia every year, but the real number of missing people is actually only closer to 30, which are those that don't return home after 3 months. Now, this can lead police to, consciously or subconsciously, believe that the person being reported missing will eventually turn up, and sometimes they don't take the missing persons investigations as seriously as they should. But on the 4th of September 2009, Colleen convinced the Alice Springs police to open a missing persons case for Karlie and let them know that Karlie had left in 2008 with a man named Daniel Marshall. Now, the police actually ended up contacting Daniel 3 days later, who denied having seen Karlie since very early that year. She had told him she was living in Queensland with another man and she hadn't been in contact since. He said he might still have some of her things, including her mobile phone, and that he would call them back when he found it. Not surprisingly, the police never heard back from Daniel, but they did check Karlie's bank activity and noticed it had been used as recently as that same week, giving them confidence that she was still alive. They also ran a search on Karlie's maroon station wagon and discovered that it had been traded in for another vehicle with the name Derek Dover on the paperwork. Derek Dover, who was married to Daniel's cousin, said that he had dropped Karlie off at a bus stop in December of 2008 and hadn't seen her since. The police say that Colleen called them on the 10th of September, 6 days after opening the case, to close it, because she had heard from her daughter. But Scott Povey and Tanya Weber claim this is completely untrue. It was the police that had called Colleen and let her know that Karlie had contacted them but didn't want to speak with her family, but that she was alive and well, and the police had closed the case. Tanya recalls in great detail the look of disappointment on Colleen's face when she got the call from the police, and she had even driven Colleen to the station to pick up the photograph that they had given police for the investigation. Scott also remembers coming home to find a distraught Colleen with the photo and the report. Now, years later, when detectives reviewed the case, they were not happy that officers had closed the missing persons case without anyone actually physically citing Karlie, and that they had relied on bank activity to confirm that she was alive. Now, after the missing persons case was closed, the family received sporadic messages from Karlie's phone, and only days after the closure of the report, Karlie had again contacted Colleen, and again hiding it from Scott, Colleen had deposited $500 into her daughter's bank account. When Scott found the money gone, he was angry, but even more than that, he was sad. I mean, what had they done so wrong that Karlie never wanted to see them again? In September of 2010, Colleen had major surgery for her rapidly developing cancer and had received a message from Karlie's phone saying that she was living in Noosa Heads in Queensland and needed money. Colleen's health was declining, and doctors in 2008 had told them that she might only have 1 year at best, but she was still fighting. She was holding on to hope that she would see her daughter and her granddaughter again before she died. She had received a phone call from Kylie in late 2010 or early 2011. The voice was muffled and strained and said that she had 2 phones now and she was in hiding, and Colleen didn't really understand a lot of it. Colleen's mother, Connie, passed away in September of 2011, and the family was devastated that Kylie hadn't returned for the funeral. Scott was furious and confused, and Colleen was running out of time to see her family again before the cancer took her life. Colleen was eventually moved into palliative care, and doctors had let her family know to get her affairs in order. The nurses told the family that Colleen had been asking constantly about where Kylie and Khandalyce were, and she was asking her family that same question over and over. She had even once hallucinated that the girls had been there with her in the hospital room. Her sister Ray had even gone to the police station to ask them to try to get in touch with Kylie to let her know that her mother was about to die and that they wanted both girls to be at the funeral. But the police had let the family know that they'd been completely unable to contact her. She had moved on from her last known address, and they hadn't been able to reach her ex-partner Daniel either. On the 6th of February 2012, Colleen passed away at only 44 years of age. Scott said that while he held her hand as she went, he knew that Kylie wasn't coming home. Now, we know that Angel, who was found in 2010, was identified as Karlie Pearce-Stevenson 5 years later in 2015. So what had happened between Kylie walking out of Scott and Colleen's house in 2008 and the discovery of her remains in the Belanglo State Forest? During the 2015 investigation, police interviewed a number of witnesses and people of interest, including Hazel, Daniel's cousin Christine, and her partner Derek, to piece the story together. Now, surprisingly, police were actually able to also interview Daniel, because he was in prison. He had been sentenced to jail time for the sexual abuse of a 9-year-old girl in Blue Bay of New South Wales. He had been staying there at the local caravan park in 2013 with his then 17-year-old girlfriend, Toni Blundell, a girl who was 22 years his junior. He was sentenced to an abysmally small 4-year sentence with a non-parole period of 2 years, and was in the Cessnock prison when police came to interview him. Now, in Daniel's version of events, in November 2008, he left Alice Springs with Kylie and Khandalyce. He told police that he needed her support and company because he was still dealing with the trauma of the car accident that had killed his stepchildren. Hazel had blamed him for the accident and he wasn't coping very well, and Kylie made him feel better. And it led to a relationship between the two of them that was way closer than just friends. They had driven to a motel close by the hospital where Hazel's sister was staying and had stayed there for 2 weeks, until after the funeral of Ryan and Willow. Daniel said that Hazel's family had continued to send him threatening messages, so he decided to take Kylie and Khandalyce and leave Adelaide. They stayed for a while at Daniel's aunt's house, but left soon after to live with his cousin Christine Lancaster and her husband Derek Dover in Canberra. He said that Kylie and Christine clashed over a lot of issues, mainly that Kylie was late on paying her board and that Kylie was critical of the way that Christine was raising her children. He said that on the 14th of December, a huge fight had broken out between Derek, Christine, and Kylie. Daniel then claimed that when he went to talk to Kylie about it, she said that they wanted her out of the house right away. Daniel claimed he had found and paid for a cheap motel for her to stay at and had dropped her off, without Khandalyce. According to Daniel, she was in no state to look after her daughter and was more than happy that Daniel was taking her off her hands for a while. He had then taken Kylie's car in return for the outstanding board that she owed Christine and Derek. He then claimed that Kylie just handed over her bank card, and that was to pay him back for all of the drugs that he'd been supplying her. And she had told him to just take money off it whenever it was available. Her welfare payments were going in every couple of weeks, and Daniel was fine to just withdraw it whenever there was money in it. Daniel said he had given the car to Derek to trade in because at the time he didn't have a license. He said that when he decided to move back to Adelaide with Hazel, he dropped Khandalyce off at the motel with her mother, and that was the last time he'd ever seen either of the girls. He said that he mailed the bank card back to his cousin's place a few months later because he assumed that Kylie would just still be there. Daniel's version of events changed many times over the same interview, especially the details about the last time that he'd seen Kylie. Now, detectives pushed him on this point, and Daniel finally broke down and admitted that he had still been seeing Kylie through 2009, but that it was behind Hazel's back and he didn't want Hazel to find out about it. The detectives actually had to convince him that they weren't going to tell Hazel what he said to them, so he decided to tell them his version of the truth. He told them that the girls had arrived in Adelaide in early 2009 and that they'd stayed for a few months. He then changed his story again, saying that they had actually stayed in Adelaide for about a year. Now, detectives were noticing the holes in Daniel's story and the ever-changing details, but what they hadn't told Daniel is that they were also getting information from Hazel, Tony Blundell, and Christine and Derek. Now, Christine and Derek were being interviewed at the exact same time that Daniel was. According to them, Daniel had arrived on their doorstep in early December with a girl called Kylie and her baby daughter Khandalyce. They both claimed in separate interviews that it was actually Daniel that had fought with Kylie on the 14th of December and that Khandalyce had been left with the two of them while Kylie and Daniel went for a drive to figure things out. He and Kylie left in Kylie's car, and Daniel arrived the next day alone with scratches on his face. He had removed a blanket from the boot of the car and then set about cleaning the vehicle. Christine had asked where Kylie was, and Daniel told her that they'd fought and he dropped her off at the bus stop. When Christine asked why she would leave her daughter, Daniel replied that sometimes she does that, and that he was going to drop Khandalyce back off with her grandmother in South Australia. Derek told police that Daniel had asked him to help trade in Kylie's car, and 2 days later, Daniel strapped candles into the new car and had taken off to South Australia. Now, a few years later, Christine had ended up asking Daniel what had happened to Candles and how the journey getting her to her grandma's had gone, and Daniel told her it went fine. The police were still very suspicious. They wondered why Derek didn't ask any questions when Daniel came back with Kylie's car and had also helped him trade it in when Kylie was nowhere to be found. Wouldn't she need a vehicle? She's a young girl with a small child. Colleen's missing persons report years earlier mentioned that Derek had told the police that he had dropped Kylie off at a bus stop, but Derek denied ever making that statement. Now, other officers were also investigating the family property of Tony Blundell at the exact same time. They had found some very interesting evidence there. Daniel and Tony had stayed there for a while before moving to the caravan park in New South Wales. And although it seemed like Tony hated Daniel for what he had done to that little girl in that caravan park, and so she should, she still had not thrown any of his things away, which included Kylie's mobile phone. They also found Tony's diary, and in it, one paragraph stood out. Tony had written that Daniel had told her that he had killed both Kylie and Khandalyce and had been making it seem like they were still alive. It said that Tony didn't think this was true because she knew that people had given Kylie money for her birthday in 2010 and 2011. The diary also mentioned that Tony had received a message from Hazel in 2013 saying that the girls were dead and that she had seen pictures of them. Now, this opened a whole new line of investigation for police. What pictures had Hazel seen? How did Hazel know that the girls were dead in 2013? And who did Tony know that had given her money in 2010 and 2011? Along with the phone and diary, police also found Daniel's mobile phone with Kylie's SIM card in it. They'd found Kylie and Khandalyce's Medicare card, an ANZ bank card in the name of Daniel Marshall, and Kylie's Alice Springs library card. That morning, investigators had also landed on the doorstep of Hazel Passmore and her new partner, James Matheson. They let Hazel know they were there investigating the murder of Kylie and Khandalyce and that they suspected that she had some knowledge or involvement in the murders. Hazel let the officers know that Daniel had taken off with Kylie while she was still in hospital and she didn't know anything about what had happened to them after that. She told the officers about Daniel returning back to her a month later and that it wasn't an ideal relationship. She still did blame him for the deaths of her children and also for abandoning her in her time of need. She had asked him about Kylie and he told her a number of stories, including that she had gone back to her ex Robbie Frampton. Now Hazel knew that this wasn't true because she had recently received messages from Robbie asking where Kylie was. And after questioning Daniel some more, Daniel finally told her that Kylie had actually moved to Queensland with some other guy. Hazel still really didn't believe him and thought that he was cheating on her, and she eventually became paranoid about his fidelity. She was going through his messages, his phone history, and she was searching his car for any evidence. He would disappear to visit his cousins in Canberra on a regular basis, and Hazel suspected that this is where he was keeping Kylie on the side. Hazel had now been speaking to detectives freely for hours, but she was all over the place, jumping around in time, and it was really hard for the detectives to know if she was telling the truth. When they eventually brought the conversation back to the murders of Kylie and Khandalyce, Hazel told them that she remembered the news coverage of the little girl found in the suitcase and had recognized some of the clothing. She remembered that they had bought Candles and Lauren similar clothing to wear when they were little. Detectives now needed to turn the investigation towards Hazel and Daniel's sexual history. They knew that Daniel had an interest sexually in children due to his criminal conviction, and they really needed to see how far this went, considering they were dealing with the death of a small girl. Whilst Hazel was not initially forthcoming, she eventually started to relax and ended up telling the detectives that her and Daniel would write out exotic stories and read them to each other before they were intimate. It was the way that Daniel became aroused. As time went on, the stories and the subjects of them became more and more disturbing, eventually involving sex and children. While Hazel was in her paranoia about Daniel being unfaithful, she had found child pornography on his computer and had installed a program to track the websites that he was visiting. She had admitted that there were thousands of downloaded pornographic images and that most of them were definitely featuring underage girls. The officers then asked Hazel if she had ever found any images of Kylie or Khandalyce on the computer, and Hazel shocked them by revealing that, yeah, she had. They asked her for more details, what the photos were of, and Hazel admitted that she had seen a picture of Kylie with her eyes closed, appearing to be either asleep or unconscious, with an alcohol bottle between her legs. She was wearing a t-shirt and nothing else, and was lying next to a big tree or log, and there was no red dirt, so Hazel didn't think the photo could have been taken anywhere in Alice Springs, which is known for its red soil. She said there was also another picture of Kylie lying with her legs out, hair covering her face next to the same fallen log. Now this admission shocked the detectives. The circumstances of this photo were eerily similar to the location of where Kylie had been found. Now at this moment, Hazel's memory started getting foggy. She couldn't remember the colour of the shirt in the photo, and she couldn't remember if the photo was on a SIM card or an SD card, but that Daniel had kept all of those, so she wouldn't know where it was, and she had never made any copies. The detectives bagged a few pieces of what they thought could be evidence from the house, and they started to wrap up the interview. They suspected that Hazel knew a lot more than she was letting on, but they had a lot of information and mountains of evidence to look into, and at this time their number one priority was to find the photographs of Kylie. Now back in the Cessnock police station, Daniel's interview was still in progress. The investigators had an inkling that Kylie had died back in 2008, but her bank account had continued to be accessed until 2012 and was eventually closed due to inactivity in 2015. Now, as well as her bank card being used, in 2010 someone had physically gone into the bank saying that they were Kylie. The bank records showed a woman in a wheelchair and a man that was of similar build to Daniel Holdem having gone into the bank and withdrawn money from Kylie's bank account. Now, they not only withdrew money, but they also got a new card issued to them, and had all of the bank's mail redirected to an address that Daniel and Hazel had had at that time. This same address was also listed on her Centrelink and her Medicare accounts. Karlie's card had frequently been used throughout 2009 and 2010, and it had also been used to book a flight to Adelaide from Canberra in 2012. Now, Karlie was nowhere on the passenger manifest, but guess who was? Daniel Holdem. Now, financial records for Daniel, Hazel and Karlie showed that Daniel's account was accessed frequently at the exact same ATM only minutes after Karlie's was. In the 4 years since they suspected that Karlie had died, almost $72,000 had been withdrawn from her accounts, and it was made up of welfare payments, tax office deposits, and the money her family had sent to her. They also noticed that the $500 deposit that Colleen had made in September had been withdrawn that same day, indicating that someone was in contact with Karlie's family, pretending to be her and tormenting these poor people. They asked Daniel whether at this point he was in control of the accounts. Now, Daniel gave no coherent answer to this question, but he talked about his 2011 breakup with Hazel and how she had had access to Karlie's card. He denied withdrawing the cash from Karlie's account, but he did admit to running a scam that involved registering businesses and claiming the GST refunds from the tax office, and he had used Karlie's account for this scam. He also admitted to having his wages deposited into that account. Now, he claimed that Karlie was alive and well when this was happening, and that's the only reason why the money was being deposited into her account. He faltered frequently at the insistent questioning about the transactions, and he switched between Karlie going to the bank and withdrawing cash to him doing it by himself to them both doing it and then splitting the money. The detectives then had him confirm the last time that he really saw Karlie, and he told them it was in late 2009 when they withdrew a large amount of cash from her account and split it. He had kept Karlie's bank card. He told them that he kept all the bank cards of all the friends that he had used the names on in his tax office scams so that he could continue to use their identities. Now, during Holdem's interview, detectives were frequently getting the information from the other police interviews that were happening at the same time. They took a break to change the tapes and got information that had come from Hazel about the disturbing images of children and the images of Karlie. Now, Daniel admitted to taking pictures of Karlie, but only ever in the bedroom and never outside. The detectives then had to breach the subject of unlawful contact with Khandalyce, and Daniel adamantly denied any inappropriate contact with her. Now, as the interview was coming to an end, detectives asked Daniel if he had killed Karlie. He said no. They asked him if he had killed Khandalyce. He said no. They asked him if he had put Khandalyce's body into the suitcase. He said no. And they asked him if he had dumped the suitcase on the road. And he said no. Police then told Daniel a couple of things. Number one, that they had a recording of a call that he'd made from the jail cell to a friend who had some of his possessions. They had contacted this friend and found Khandalyce's birth certificate in his possession. Number two, they told Daniel about the other interviews that were being conducted that day. Now, both of these things seemed to stress Daniel out. They also brought up the statements that Daniel had told people that he killed the girls and that he was making it appear like she was still alive. Daniel was flustered and stressed and denied absolutely everything, and he swore on his daughter's life that he had nothing to do with killing anyone. The next day, detectives from New South Wales, ACT and South Australia held a teleconference with each other to share additional information from all of the interviews that they had held. In the middle of this discussion, the Adelaide detectives received an urgent interruption. Hazel Passmore's sister Amanda had just walked into a South Australian police station with the SD card that contained the photos of Karlie Pearce-Stevenson. Investigators from all 3 states knew that this SD card was key to the investigation, but none of them had held out much hope of actually finding it. Daniel Holdem had a habit of leaving his possessions everywhere, all over Australia, at friends' houses and ex-partners' houses, and Hazel had told them it had been lost. So finding it was a huge breakthrough in the case. Now, as it had turned out, Hazel, in fear that Daniel might hurt her, had given it to her sister back in 2012 for safekeeping. The sisters had since fallen out, and when Amanda had seen the news coverage about Khandalyce and the resulting identification of Karlie, she had simply walked into the police station and handed the card over. Now, over the next few days, the police were able to recover not only the images on the card, but also the images that had previously been deleted. Now, police were horrified with what they found on the card. Some of the pictures depicted Karlie lying on her back next to a large log, wearing the angelic t-shirt that had been found 5 years earlier. They compared this photo to the position of the skeletal remains that they had found in Belanglo, and the position of the body was almost identical to where the bulk of the remains had been found. They also found a photo of her upper body and face with another person's leg and foot on her neck. One of the detectives later said that it was a surreal moment to compare the photos to the evidence and to realize that these were pictures of Karlie at the moment of her death. Police were also able to recover photos that linked Daniel Holdem directly to the evidence, images of Hazel and Lauren, and images of properties that Daniel had lived at over the years. Now, a week after detectives had interviewed Holdem, he had contacted police to say that he had more information to share with them. In the time since his first interview, he had actually been moved out of general population. The media hadn't reported his name, but they had reported that police were investigating a very strong suspect in the case. And after Holdem had been pulled out for interviews and had had his cell searched, it didn't take long for the other prisoners to catch on. And now not only was he a child rapist, he was also a child killer and was in real danger of what is commonly known as prison justice. Now, while he was in solitary, he no doubt was worried about what the other interviews had uncovered, so he reached out to detectives to make some more confessions. Now, as soon as detectives arrived and had set up the recorder in the interview room, Holdem began to talk, and all of it was to blame Derek Dover. He said it was Derek who had dropped Karlie off at the bus stop on the 14th of December. He told them that Derek had been the one to show up alone the next day with Karlie's phone and bank cards and her car, but at that point Holdem, this upstanding gentleman, wanted no further part in whatever was going on, so he decided to head to Queensland with Hazel to stay with her grandmother for a while. Derek, according to Holdem, had insisted on posting the card to him in Queensland because Derek wanted to make it look like Karlie had been there. He claimed that when Derek had been contacted by missing persons in 2009, he had immediately called Daniel and Hazel to tell them what to say and to give them a number to pass on to missing persons for Karlie. Daniel then said that it was Christine Lancaster who had called the police pretending to be Karlie to let them know that she was okay. Now, this does back up Tanya Weber and Scott Povey's version of the closure of the missing persons report, but there is no evidence that Christine ever made that call. Holdem then told them that he was happy to go crown witness as long as his name was left out of papers and media, and of course he would need to go into witness protection. Detectives felt like Holdem was still lying through his teeth. He was jumping from subject to subject, and he kept hinting at negotiating with authorities for information. This king of the douchebags assumed that he could use this investigation to curry some favour and get himself out of jail, a get-out-of-jail-free card, if you will. Holdem handed detectives a 7-page written statement outlining the information he'd just given them, telling them that this time it was definitely the truth, and because he was helping, they could get him out of prison, and then New South Wales police would totally pay for his witness protection. The detectives then wanted to go back through Holdem's previous statement, and he let them know that most of what he'd told them a week ago were lies. They then addressed the fact that in this new confession he had not once mentioned Khandalyce, and they asked him if he thought it was unusual that Karlie would have boarded a bus without her daughter. Holdem was not expecting the question. He stuttered, he flustered, he ummed and he ahed, and eventually he said that Derek had actually taken Khandalyce with him, that he dropped both the girls off. They then took a break from the interview to change out the recording tape, and the detectives got a piece of information that would change the direction of this interview for good. They had been having Karlie and Holdem's phone records reviewed while they were speaking with Holdem, and they had finally received the results. Holdem and Karlie's phones had both pinged at a cell tower in the early hours of the 15th of December in the vicinity of the Belanglo State Forest. This information was enough for detectives to upgrade Holdem's status from person of interest to prime suspect. 5 years and 2 months after the discovery of Karlie's remains, detectives officially charged Daniel Holdem with her murder. It was big news. The media had been waiting a long time to report a name, and now they finally had it. And while police knew that Daniel had most likely also killed Khandalyce, they didn't have enough evidence to charge him, and they didn't know what state she had been killed in, so they weren't even sure which police department should be handling the case. The last time the girl had been seen was in ACT, but her body had been found in South Australia, and it was assumed that she had died somewhere in between, which could have been in New South Wales. Now, in the 12 days since Hazel had spoken to police, media had caught on to her location and had begun camping outside of her house. They had connected the dots between the report of someone entering the bank in a wheelchair pretending to be Kylie and Hazel's medical situation. But so far she had remained completely silent about her involvement. But now police had to make a decision. They desperately needed the information that they were sure that Hazel had, but they had no way of getting it. New South Wales and South Australian detectives decided that they would offer her what's called an inducement, which is where any statements she made would not be used as evidence against her. It wasn't quite indemnity, because if they found other evidence linking her to the case, she would still face criminal charges. Hazel, in the meantime, had hired herself a lawyer and arrived with him and with a criminal barrister. With the two men in tow, Hazel entered the Elizabeth Police Station in Adelaide, and after being reminded that the deal was only valid if she told the truth, Hazel began telling them what she knew of Karlie and Khandalyce's last days alive and the fraud that had taken place after their deaths. Hazel told them that when Daniel had come back to her in December of 2008, he would travel back to Canberra frequently. She was worried that he was keeping the girls there so that he could go back and cheat on her with Karlie. She had found one of Karlie's bank cards while she was searching Daniel's car for evidence of infidelity in mid-2009, and when she confronted Daniel with it, he claimed that Karlie was gone, and gone for good. That he had violated her with the alcohol bottle, and then he had stomped on her and crushed her windpipe. It was the first time that the detectives had heard what they thought might actually be the truth about what had happened to Karlie. Hazel told them that she didn't believe Daniel. She thought that he was making it up to cover up the other lies and the cheating that she suspected was still happening. The detectives wanted to turn back to the 19th of December when Holdem had told her he was coming back to her. Police knew that throughout the day he was in regular contact with Hazel, and they wanted to know if Hazel remembered whether or not Khandalyce was with him at the time. Hazel told them that she didn't remember hearing the child in the background during the journey. She said that she had heard a child in the background before he had left Christine and Derek's house, but she had just assumed that this was Christine's children and not Khandalyce. The detectives needed more information about the day leading up to Holdem arriving back at Hazel's house. The trip that he had made should have taken 13 hours, but it took him almost 24. They then questioned why Hazel hadn't pushed Daniel about being 11 hours overdue. She told them that he had mentioned having some car troubles, but he wasn't in the mood to talk and had gone straight to bed, and she didn't want to push him away again when he had only just come back to her, so she dropped it. They asked her again if she had talked to him about Karlie and Khandalyce after that. Considering she'd been so paranoid about him cheating, Surely she would have questioned him about where they were and what had happened to them. Hazel said that he told her that Kylie had run off with some guy to Queensland and that he didn't mention any names, which, yeah, she sort of felt was a little bit sus, but she hadn't pressed him on that. By that point, she was on methadone and her attention span wasn't all that long, so again, she dropped the subject. They then took Hazel back to when she had found Kylie's things in Daniel's car months after he'd come back to her. She remembered having to rummage through the rubbish and the takeaway wrappers to find not only Kylie's bank card but also the Medicare card, a pension card, and Khandalyce's birth certificate that years later ended up with Daniel's friend. Holdem had actually caught Hazel going through these documents, and she was irate. She started accusing him of cheating on her with Kylie, and at first he told her it was just stuff Kylie had left in the car months beforehand. But Hazel went crazy. She started screaming and crying, and Daniel at that point grabbed her by the throat, dragged her inside the house, and started shaking her, telling her that he was not cheating, that Kylie was gone, that he had killed her by crushing her windpipe and by stomping on her. The detectives were stunned that he had shared this information and that Hazel hadn't come forward. She said that she had Googled whether any bodies had been found, but that's about as far as she'd gone to verify what he had told her. In an attempt to justify this, Hazel said that she didn't really want to know if it was true. She preferred to think that he was lying to her. They asked if she knew why he had done it, and she said that he told her he'd done it for her. And it was in 2010 that Hazel started going through Holdem's stuff again, and it was in this search that she'd found the infamous SD card. She knew that Daniel wasn't a huge photo taker, so she was pretty curious as to what was on the card. When she looked through the photos, she saw the ones of Kylie. Now at first Holdem tried to convince her that it was not Kylie, it was someone else altogether, but she persisted, and he finally broke down and told her that he had killed both Kylie and Khandalyce in the forest, and had left Kylie's body there after violating it, and he'd thrown Khandalyce's body out of the car on the highway on his way back to Adelaide. But, she said, he hadn't mentioned anything about a suitcase. Now, given Hazel's constant medicated state and the amount of time that had passed between his admission to her and this interview, her memory wasn't the sharpest, and some of her information didn't fit the evidence the detectives had. Hazel was telling them that the girls had been killed at the same time in the same place, but the evidence only pointed to Kylie dying at that location. But they needed to press on with the interview. Now, due to Holdem's previous sexual interest in children, they needed to know what exactly he had told Hazel about Khandalyce. They told her that they were satisfied that she had had nothing to do with the murders, but they needed her to tell them exactly what he had done to this poor little girl. They didn't want the toned-down version. They wanted the truth. They wanted the ugly, disgusting, despicable truth. Now, Hazel had trouble getting the information out. It was very disturbing, and she found it hard to put into words. She said that he had told her that he had been assaulting the young girl, and during this abhorrent act of child abuse, the girl had been crying. So to stop her, he had pushed something down her throat. Hazel told them she thought he had said it was panties, but we now know that it was dishcloths. This poor beautiful child had suffocated to death. The detectives knew that this might have been a possibility, but it shocked them to hear Hazel reveal this information, especially because she had stayed with Holdem even after he had confessed this to her. They were having a really hard time believing that anyone could stay with a man who had done the things that Holdem had done. Hazel told them that she still really didn't believe him and couldn't find any evidence to support his confession. But who admits to something like that if they didn't do it, just to prove that they weren't cheating? Like, surely cheating is the better of two evils there. By 2011, Hazel had come to realise that Holdem was probably more than capable of doing what he said he had done, but she still had no evidence to prove it. She did know, though, that she needed to get out of the relationship. She said she had tried breaking up with him for a few months, but as with all of Daniel Holdem's ex-partners, he refused to take no for an answer. He would show up at her door, he constantly called her, and he refused to move any of his things out of the house. In 2012, while Hazel was in surgery, she even had Daniel look after Lauren. After learning what he'd done to this other little girl, she left her own daughter with him. She did say that she saw the 2015 coverage about the discovery of the body in the suitcase and thought it could have been Khandalyce, but still had not come forward. The police then presented Hazel with some notebooks that they had found among Holdem's possessions, and some of the writings were the exotic stories that they had written, but some of them indicated that Holdem had been a sexual predator for a long, long time, and they included a list of children's names. Hazel confirmed that this was Daniel's handwriting, but as to the list of names, she denied any knowledge of ever having seen it before. She also admitted that she had participated in the fraud of Karlie's accounts for years, appearing at both the Centrelink office and the bank. She said that Holdem had been insistent that Karlie owed him money, and because she'd run off to another guy in Queensland, that it was only fair for them to be ripping her off. Now, this clashed directly with earlier evidence given by Hazel, saying that she already knew that Daniel had killed them. Now, police made the decision in December of 2015 to charge Daniel Holdem with the murder of 2-year-old Khandalyce Pearce. They still needed to gather more evidence, but they wanted Holdem to know that they knew that he had done it. Now, it took almost a year to get the full picture of what had happened to this beautiful little girl. Police had traced Holdem and Karlie's phone records since they left Canberra in 2008, and they'd also reviewed Holdem's bank records to see where he had spent money, which could give them an idea of what had happened between the 14th of December, when he left his cousin's house with Kylie, and when he arrived at Hazel's house on the 20th of December. They discovered that Daniel had left with Kylie at about 2:30 a.m. on the 15th of December, and had arrived in the area of the Belanglo State Forest about 4:30 a.m. that same morning. The records showed that he had remained in that spot for over 7 hours just before 12 p.m. Using the timestamps from the photographs he had taken, he left the forest about 45 minutes after he had taken the last picture of Kylie. The records suggested that Daniel had started to head back, pulling over to make regular phone calls. He was switching between his and Kylie's phones. He had arrived back at Derek and Christine's house at around 2 p.m. that day. He told them that he'd had a fight with Kylie and he'd taken her to a motel. He said that he would be taking Khandalyce back to her grandmother's house in South Australia, and then he went with Derek and traded Kylie's station wagon in for the Holden Statesman. A few days later, on the 19th of December, in the very early hours of the morning, Daniel left with Khandalyce. Now, just before 3 a.m, cell towers picked him up in a small town called Bookham, and 4 hours later a call was made by his phone near a town called Coolac, almost exactly between Melbourne and Sydney. Now, if he'd driven that route straight through, it should have taken him just over 30 minutes, but it took Daniel Holdem 4 hours. By 8:15 that morning, he'd arrived in Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. His bank records showed that he'd made a purchase at the grocery store, and luckily this store had kept a receipt of that purchase. It was the single most telling piece of evidence in the investigation of Khandalyce's murder so far. His purchase included 3 large garbage bags, a 10-pack of dishcloths, and a roll of home handyman duct tape, the exact same duct tape that was found on Khandalyce's skull 7 years later. He continued his journey, and at 11:05 a.m, bank records showed that he paid $85 for a room at a motel. Now, 8 years after he had made the journey, detectives arrived at the motel to see if there was any possibility of getting any evidence of what had happened there. The motel had changed owners in that time, so the detectives needed to make a visit to the previous owner's residence. They wanted to know if she had kept any records from that time, but they'd come to a dead end. She didn't keep documents from that far back. They then asked if she remembered the towels they had used at the time, mentioning a towel they had found at Hazel's residence. The detectives had gotten the batch number for the towels, but had no luck of finding a match at any of the establishments that they had checked up until this point. The previous owner immediately recognized it, and yes, they had used those towels, and she still used them to wash her dogs. She was able to produce one right away, and the batch numbers matched. Now, a few days later, she actually contacted police. She had found the guest check-in records that they had been looking for, and they found that Daniel had checked in under the name of Daniel Marshall, had listed Christine and Derek's house as his residence, and had booked a room for one adult and one child. This was strong evidence that this might have been the place that Khandalyce had died. Now, he only stayed at the motel for just over 2 hours, and at 1:20 p.m. that afternoon, Holdem left the motel. He travelled through New South Wales and then travelled through Victoria. At midnight, his phone registered near Karoonda Exchange, and then an hour later, it registered near a town in the Murray Valley. The main road connecting these two towns was the Karoonda Highway, the same highway that the suitcase and Khandalyce's body had been found. At just after 2 a.m, he arrived on Hazel's doorstep, about 24 hours after he had left Canberra, and he was alone. In August of 2017, almost 9 years after he had murdered Kylie, Daniel Holdem was to face his committal hearing. Now, this guy tried everything to delay this hearing. He fired his legal team. He needed his new team to be able to go through the brief. He left the brief in his jail cell. Could he have a laptop to review it? No, he couldn't, because the prison only allowed them 1 hour of computer time a day. He wanted to hire a private solicitor, but he still needed to wait for his legal aid application to be approved. He was just trying anything that he could to delay this process for as long as humanly possible. He said that he hadn't had time to go through the full brief because he'd been in hospital. He was trying anything that he could. And the hearing did end up being delayed after his never-ending excuses. But when it finally did go ahead, the prosecution had mountains of evidence against him. They had the statements from all of the witnesses that police had interviewed. They had the physical evidence, such as the photos and the guest registry, and they also had all of the phone and the bank records. The magistrate was very satisfied with the evidence presented, and Holdem was going to stand trial. He entered his plea on the 2nd of February 2018 and, surprise, surprise, pleaded not guilty to both murders. Holdem's trial was scheduled for the 6th of August 2018, the day before Kylie would have turned 30. But 7 days before his trial was supposed to begin on the 31st of July, his name was listed on a docket in Sydney's Supreme Court. To the shock and surprise of law enforcement, Daniel Holdem pleaded guilty in front of a judge and witnesses to the murder of Karlie Jade Pearce-Stevenson and to the murder of Khandalyce Pearce. Almost no one knew this plea was coming. Detectives had subpoenaed over 180 witnesses to give evidence at his trial, and Holdem had been defiant in maintaining his innocence this entire time. The media didn't even know it was coming, and none of the usual court reporters except for one were even in attendance. It was so quiet for such a huge step in the investigation. The lead detective was able to call Kylie's father and stepfather to tell them the news. He also told them that because the indictment had been read out in court, it was official. They could share the news with the rest of their family. Holdem's sentencing hearing would be scheduled for the 28th of September. On the day of the hearing, a multitude of Kylie and Kandal's friends and family were in attendance, and Holdem didn't look a single one of them in the eye. Scott Povey and Bruce Pearce were both joining via satellite, but on Scott Povey's request, they had covered the video monitor so that Daniel couldn't see Scott's face. Scott did not want this monster to know how his actions had affected him. Scott and Bruce both had the opportunity to share their victim impact statements. Now, Scott had been struggling on whether he was going to give one at all. He had so far rejected all media requests, and he wanted to grieve and feel his pain in private. He had previously decided that he was not going to give one, but on a call that morning from his homicide victim support person, Debbie Gibson, he had changed his mind. He would share it, but he would need her to read it for him. He just couldn't do it. Now, he had reduced the statement from 30 pages to 6, and I'm not going to read you the whole statement, but there is one part I wanted to share with you. He says, "I am sorry, Karlie, for being angry because you wouldn't talk to your mum for so long. I am sorry that I blamed you for your mum's sadness and for being angry when you didn't come home to say goodbye to your mum. We didn't know that you couldn't. I know now that I will never see you to say I'm sorry." Karlie's aunt Kelly was the one who read out Bruce Pearce's statement, and again, I'm not going to read you the whole thing because I don't want to cry on video, but Bruce focused on the visit that the three had made to his home in 2008. He said, "How could I have protected her? If I was at Mum's house when you were there, would I have been able to keep them here to protect them? Would they have stayed for longer? Could I have saved both their lives? Could I have made a difference?" Now, I can't imagine how these men feel knowing that they held that anger and resentment towards Karlie for years, not even knowing that she wasn't alive. I mean, that's just heartbreaking. And there were facts about this case that had still yet to be revealed, but this hearing was starting to expose them all. The prosecution team noted that there was a level of planning involved and that both murders were reprehensible. The defense team, of course, brought up all of Holdem's mistreatment as a child and also said that, he pleaded guilty because taking responsibility for these atrocious crimes was some sort of defense, apparently. He also had his defense team issue an apology to the family, which felt like it was forced and he did it because he had to, not because he actually felt bad about it. I mean, so much so that the justice said, "I'm going to have to think on whether I give that any weight at all." Now, after pleading guilty in July, Holdem had also needed to attend a psychiatric interview in August of 2018 with Dr. Olav Nielsen. He spoke to Dr. Nielsen about his upbringing, the 2008 car crash that had killed his stepchildren, as well as his multiple suicide attempts in prison and all of his failed relationships. Now, the justice chose to read a part of the interview, and the bored, almost nonchalant way that he talks about the crimes floored everyone in the room. He said, "It was horrible, I guess. She got suffocated. Not turning up with her mum would have raised questions." This explanation as to why he had killed the little girl was so unconvincing to both the family and to the judge. Now, his psychiatric interview also revealed more information about what had actually happened in the Belanglo Forest. According to that interview, Holdem and Karlie had gone into the forest to have some intimate time together when he had suddenly snapped. Karlie had said something about telling Hazel that their affair started back in Alice Springs, and Holdem grabbed a broom handle that had been used to hold up Karlie's car's tailpipe, and as he'd been using drugs heavily, he went into a drug-fueled rage and had swung the broom handle into her ribs. In the interview, Daniel told the doctor that Karlie had then started vomiting blood, and this had scared him, so he took off. But this was not consistent with the evidence. I mean, how did he explain taking pictures of Karlie's dead body if he had left while Karlie was still alive? He also said that defrauding Karlie's family, her bank accounts and her welfare payments was to fund his drug habits and to provide for Hazel and Lauren and to pay their living expenses. Now, the judge was not satisfied. He acknowledged that this was not a straightforward case, but he also said that Holdem had decided not to give him a valid reason as to why he had committed these vile acts. He said that he needed enough time to go through everything, and so he ruled that the sentencing would be delivered in November. At the sentencing on the 30th of November 2018, almost 10 years since Daniel Holdem had killed 20-year-old Karlie and 2-year-old Khandalyce, there was almost no empty seats. Family and friends of the girls had arrived in droves, and dozens of detectives had appeared to witness the sentencing, and the courtroom was also packed with journalists. The justice was ready. He had his 25 pages of judgment prepared, but there was only one problem. A few minutes before the sentencing was to start, Holdem told his solicitor that he wanted to retract his guilty plea. This was a craven and spineless attempt to delay proceedings yet again. In the 4 months since he'd pleaded guilty, he had spoken to the psychiatrist about how he had murdered them, and he'd also attended his own sentencing hearing where his lawyers talked about why he had murdered them. His lawyers claimed that he did not have a full understanding of the evidence and didn't understand what he was pleading guilty to. Now, this was not flying with the judge. He said that Holdem had had 4 months to go through the evidence against him, but because Holdem's legal team did not have time to provide an argument to support Holdem's change of heart, the court had a brief recess to discuss this turn of events. Court then resumed at 11 a.m. Now, Holdem's legal team claimed that as Holdem had been in segregation, he hadn't had the opportunity to understand or fully comprehend some of the brief of charges against him, and he disputed some of the police allegations and evidence. His team claimed that this was reason enough to delay the sentencing so that Holdem could lodge the plea change application. Holdem had pages and pages of handwritten notes as to why he wanted to change his plea, and his team offered to have them tendered in court. But the prosecution quickly objected. The Crown said that they would not agree to the letter being admitted unless Holdem agreed to take the witness stand and be cross-examined on what the letter contained. Now, a very quiet, hushed conversation was held between Holdem and his legal team, and his lawyer eventually approached the bench and informed the judge that Daniel Holdem was not prepared to take the witness stand. The judge then swiftly denied the application for the plea change and without skipping a beat went straight into the judgment. He went through all of the details of the horrendous crimes, from the discovery of Karlie's body to the discovery of Khandalyce's to the phone records, to the fact that Kylie and Khandalyce's family were tormented by being made to believe that the girls were still alive, causing grief and anger that they'd never come home. He stated that Holdem's account of what had occurred in the forest was a lie. The injuries that this girl had sustained were not consistent with his version of events. He said that it was inconceivable that Holdem's explanation was what had actually happened. He also would not accept that Holdem's childhood could explain away this behaviour. Now at this, Holdem became almost offended at the suggestion that his childhood did not bear as much weight as he wanted it to in this judgment. The final statements made by the judge considered the acts against the girls by the man that stood in front of him. He was someone that Kylie trusted, and he killed her in a brutal and malicious manner, and to make it worse, he humiliated and violated her body after death, and then took those photos as his own personal sadistic trophies. He said that although Holdem had claimed that he'd done it in a drug-fueled rage, it seemed like there was definite intention to kill her before it happened. I mean, you don't need to drive 2 hours into a forest to have sex. He then spoke about the murder of this beautiful little blonde girl. He said it was hard to determine or know the exact circumstances of her murder, as Holdem had never accurately outlined what he had done, and because of the state of the body when it was found. He said there was definitely a sexual motive, but how far Holdem had taken that was unknown. What was known is that Khandalyce's last days of life would have been torture, alone, without her mother, and in the presence of this convicted sexual predator. Whether he had killed Kylie to be able to abuse her daughter, or whether he'd killed Khandalyce's mother and needed to wrap up loose ends could not be confirmed, but it was clear that the small defenseless girl had been suffocated, stuffed into a suitcase, and then discarded like rubbish on the side of the road. The justice declared that the crimes Holdem had committed were nothing short of monstrous, and that he deserved nothing less than life sentences. Daniel Holdem was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment for the murders of Karlie Pearce-Stevenson and Khandalyce Pearce. When the judge handed this verdict down, the courtroom erupted into applause. The family finally felt like they had some justice, and although it wouldn't bring their girls back, they were glad that this man would never be able to hurt anyone else for the rest of his life. He was going to die in prison. In the family's written statement, they wrote, "We can no longer hug or hold Kylie and Khandalyce, but we will never stop loving them." Karlie and Khandalyce were laid to rest with Colleen and Connie in the Alice Springs Garden Cemetery. The family had a joint headstone made for the four of them. At the top, it reads, "In loving and cherished memories of 4 generations." And at the bottom, it says, "In our hearts and each other's arms forever." Now, after hearing all of that, I don't think it's surprising to anyone that Daniel Holdem is trying to appeal his 2 life sentences. He claims there were other people involved, that Hazel was lying, that Derek didn't tell the truth, the notebooks weren't his, and he still wants to change his plea to not guilty for the murder of Khandalyce. Now, as of right now, he has not been granted leave for appeal, and I for one hope he never is. He should rot in prison. But that's just my opinion. Well guys, that's it. That is the case of Karlie Pearce-Stevenson and her daughter Khandalyce Pearce. I need a wine after that, you might too. That was a heavy one, but this is a true crime channel, so most of them will be. If you want more information, a lot of my research came from this book, The Lost Girls by Benny-Morrison. An amazing deep dive into this case. She is an Australian crime reporter, and she did such a terrific job getting all of that information together and writing it in a way that was understandable. I hope I put that into a timeline that was fairly clear. I know we jumped back and forward a little bit, but yeah, I hope I did that justice, and hopefully I will see you guys on the next one. Bye!